Welcome to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Our host is Dave Garrison from Ohio Christian University, a longtime Fortune 100 company top executive and a former U.S. congressional candidate from Texas. Our goal for the Faith and Liberty Talk Show is to give you an opportunity to listen to interviews and discussions with significant authorities and experts on subjects related to Christians engaging in the civil and political arena. The mission of the show is to give you real information and not sound bites that you can really use. We have a website for the show, faithandliberty.org. At this website, you can obtain more information about the show, our guests, subscribe to our newsletter, and become a friend of the show, and like us on our Faith and Liberty Facebook page. You can also access all of our previous shows. Please keep in mind that the Faith and Liberty Talk Show exists only with the generosity and support of our listeners. If our show is of value to you, we would appreciate you visiting our website, faithandliberty.org, and donating to the show. Now, let's begin today's show. Thank you for joining us.
Today we are here with Congressman Trey Gowdy. Anybody who knows anything about Fox News and the other news sources get to see him and his great hairdo. And he represents, I thought that'd get you. He represents the 4th District in South Carolina. And the committees and you're on is the Education and Workforce, Ethics, Judiciary, Oversight, and Government Reform. And I believe you're the chairman of the Subcommittee on Immigration and Border Security for the Judiciary Committee. Did I get that right, Congressman?
Yes, sir, you did. I had to stop and think because it's too many committees, so I was checking them off in my head, but you are exactly right.
Great. There was a famous book some years ago. It was called Death by Meetings. And I think you guys have that problem, having hung out there some. You got your undergraduate degree from Baylor University in history, which is great. I got mine from Pittsburgh in history and political science. Back then they called it pre-law. And you got your law degree from South Carolina. And the thing that's really fascinated me is you've been a federal prosecutor. And how long did you work in that role?
From 1994 to 2000, so 6 years, and the only reason I left is you can't run for political office if you are a federal prosecutor, and I wanted to be the district attorney. So I left to run for district attorney. We call it solicitor in South Carolina, but they call it district attorney everywhere else.
That's great, because I think that, well, I might as well ask you the question right now. You feel that that helps you in your role as a congressman on these committees and interviewing people and when they testify?
I think it does. Number one, it helps you understand that for the 5 minutes you see in a committee hearing, you better have prepared for a multiple of that in terms of minutes, if not hours, outside the courtroom. The best cross-examinations don't take place in committee hearings or in courtrooms. They take place weeks, if not months before when you're preparing. So I'm not smart enough to come up with these questions off the top of my head. I have to think. And when you have a limited time, which is 5 minutes in a committee hearing, it requires you to prioritize what's really important, and you have to ask questions where the answer is already kind of implicit in the question, because some of these witnesses are professional witnesses, and if you just say good morning, your 5 minutes is gone.
Well, I've watched you I'm going to use a word that you won't use, but interrogate some of these people. And you can have the questions prepared, Congressman, beforehand, but when they say something, I hear you come back, and I hear the federal prosecutor in you, and I just love it. And I think that's part of the reason people have found you to be such a wonderful influence.
Well, you're kind to say that. What I like to tell my friends in Congress is if I can't help you with the questioning of witnesses or legal issues, then you need to get rid of me, because heavens knows I'm not much help on other issues. So if I can't help you there, then you probably need to get rid of me and put somebody else. My wife wishes that I smiled more, but smiling prosecutors generally aren't very successful. So I'm usually probably not quite as mad as maybe when I watch something I think, but the issues are serious.
Yes, they are.
And I don't like I don't like evasive answers. So you have to kind of rein the witness back in. And unfortunately, despite my Southern upbringing, sometimes that means you have to interrupt them.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question and ask you, what were you thinking when you named your dogs judge, jury, and bailiff?
Well, I am honored to be in Congress, but I was talking to a friend yesterday, and I kind of call it the receiving line job, the job that you have in your life that you want people to bring up to your spouse or to your children when they are in the receiving line saying goodbye to you. And that job to me, I was and always will be prosecutor. So I wanted dogs that reminded me of the courtroom. And the next one is going to be sheriff. Now, my wife says that I will have another wife before we have another dog. So we're stuck on 3 right now. But judge, jury, and bailiff is just a daily reminder of a 16-year time period that I loved, which is when I was working with police and standing up for crime victims. So
did you name your son? I guess his name is Watson. Do you call him Dr. Watson or?
No, he is the 4th. I am the 3rd, which is where Trey comes from.
Oh, of course, sure.
And he is the 4th, and our middle name is Watson.
Oh, I see.
And so when your name is Harold Watson Gowdy the 4th, you are somewhat limited in what you can call that child. So
well, my wife
came up with Watson, and it fits.
Well, I went to high school with a guy whose name was Tarrington T. Tarbox the 3rd, so you're not a long ways from that. So,
well, some days when my mom calls me by my full name, first of all, it takes a long time. But second of all, I know that she's serious.
Oh, I remember that. My mom called me by my middle name too, all the way up to the time I was almost 50. So that's okay. Now, it's been fascinating, listeners, that wherever I go, and I get around the country quite a bit, some speaking, and because I live in Texas half the time, in Ohio half the time, I just have people keep coming up to me and saying, you need to interview Trey Gowdy on the show. People, my aunt and uncle in Illinois, and they've been bugging me about it. Our pastor's mom and dad have been bugging me about it, and all sorts of folks that I know. And you're on Fox an awful lot. I think the listeners would be really curious, Congressman, is how does Fox choose people, and quite often like yourself? I mean, what's the process that gets you on there? Is it because you're provocative or the great hairdo?
Well, you can rule out the hair. I think I might be on more if I could settle on one hairstyle, but...
Well, I'm bald, so I'm just envious.
Well, I tell people that Tim Scott and I were so tired of people confusing us the first 2 years in Congress that he shaved his head and I decided to grow mine long.
There you go.
It is, your question is better than my answer is going to be, because I don't full well know precisely how they make the decision. I think initially you have to catch the attention of the producers and the host by doing your job. And so that's what gets you on the first time.
Sure.
And then after that, I think if the audience thinks that you're plain spoken and direct, I think what people hate or what people tell me they don't like are the typical political answers where you just kind of recite back whatever talking points have been emailed out that morning. And I don't look at the talking points. So I am going to answer the question as directly as I can. And there was a piece of advice that Paul Ryan gave me early on, which is, if you do not know a lot about a topic, say no. And I say no more than you would probably imagine, because there are lots of topics I'm just not good on. And I would not benefit the audience or your audience if I went on TV and tried to talk about it. So been a little bit fortunate with the issues, Fast and Furious, the IRS, Benghazi are issues that come through my committee. And if you put the time and effort into preparing yourself, people will want to hear from you. So that's the best explanation, is that when they have you on, you answer the question, and they don't have to interrupt you much.
Well, my good friend, former Congressman Steve Austria, I guess he was on the committee with you on the oversight. I believe he was on that committee.
He must have left before I got there.
Okay. Well, isn't the Oversight and Government Reform Committee considered to be one of the most important committees in Congress, and why so?
It is, from your listeners and the citizens' perspective, it is not highly coveted among members of Congress, which is sad, but it's not. And if you want me to explain what's coveted and why, I will. But it is incredibly important.
Yes, and
when I
so
met
much
with
going
Daryl,
on there.
ISA during orientation back in 2010, I just said, "Look, I'm a washed-up former prosecutor, but I think I can help you if your goal is to engage in investigations." And he said, "Well, as fate would have it, we have something called Fast and Furious. You used to be a firearms prosecutor. Maybe you can help us with this." And I would you could offer me Ways and Means. You could offer me Energy and Commerce, which are two very highly coveted committees, and I wouldn't take them because, number one, I wouldn't be good on those committees, and number two, whatever limited abilities God may have given me are better used on oversight and judiciary.
Well, now that you just mentioned God, I always like to ask the listeners before we go too far in the show to talk a little bit about their faith, their journey. Would you mind taking a moment to discuss that? Because our listeners really like hearing that.
Sure. I grew up in your quintessential Christian home. Father's on the board of deacons. We were at church every time it opened, and we're usually the last ones to leave because my father was a pediatrician, so he got a lot of medical questions in the parking lot. And so I was baptized when I was 9 years old, having made a profession of faith during Vacation Bible School, which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with that. But as happens sometimes, you begin to have your own questions, and you begin to even question what you were taught to believe growing up. And I think the Irish poets call it a dark night of the soul, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I had graduated college, and you sit around asking all these big questions for which there is no answer. And I just remember falling to my knees at a place called Lake Lanier. I was by myself, and I just kind of said, "God, I have run out of answers, so I am going to rely solely on faith." And I call it a dark night of the soul. I was never into drugs, and I wasn't a member of a motorcycle gang or any of that. But you can still have very troubling questions of faith without that. And so that was after college and before law school. And I give 99% of the credit for whatever journey of faith that I am on now to my wife, who is the most Christ-like person I have ever met. And I have the privilege of living and have lived with that for 25 years. So when you see Christ-like qualities modeled on a daily basis, in other words, watching the sermon instead of hearing the sermon, I still have questions. One of the reasons that I thought 16 years was probably enough was watching children die. I just still, I want, like Habakkuk in the Old Testament, just asking these questions of God as if we have standing to ask them. But Habakkuk did, and he got away with it. And so, I'm sitting there thinking, God, how? Why did you let this happen? So I'm still on the journey. It's just that I've reached the point where if you're going to have Jesus as your Savior, you're also going to have him as your Lord. And you're going to just have the humility to understand there are some questions that will not be answered until the other side.
Absolutely.
And so it's a question of faith, and I want to be known as a good husband and a good father. It's fine if people say I was a good prosecutor, but I know this is bad theology, and I don't really mean it when I say it, but I tell my friends in Congress that I am trying to get to heaven. and I understand it's not by works.
Right.
But that's kind of the way I view life. I am on a journey towards a point of sanctification which I can't get to without Jesus.
Well, we all want to hear that day when Christ says to us, "Well done, good and faithful servant." So I think your theology is absolutely correct. So thank you for sharing that. You've also been described as an ardent social conservative, and that you consider yourself pro-life plus. What do you mean by pro-life plus?
Well, pro-life plus to me is putting your boots to your words. I remember having a young woman who was raped when I was the district attorney. And I was meeting with her before the trial, and I could not help but notice that she was expecting. And so we finished up our preparation, and I called her name, and I said, look, this is none of my business. But I can't help but notice that you are expecting. She had become pregnant as a result of the rape. And I said, what I'm getting ready to say is none of my business. But if you want to have that child and are worried about the family in which it will grow up, my wife and I will raise your child. If you do not want to keep it, but you wanted to have a good life. Now, I had not checked with my wife, but I also knew that my wife would rather us do that if she were contemplating something else.
And she'd get upset if you brought a dog home?
Well, she would.
I know,
She's a sweet, sweet person.
Of course she is.
But when I say pro-life plus, I mean, do you believe it enough that you're actually willing to inconvenience yourself?
Yes.
Do you believe it enough that you're actually willing to support crisis pregnancy centers, or are you simply waiting around for the Supreme Court to flip Roe versus Wade? So when I say pro-life plus, the plus part is our obligation to change hearts and minds and souls. The ultrasound, to me, has been an incredibly huge development in how people view life. It's not politicians talking about it because we are, in large measure, hypocrites and engage in duplicity. So the plus part is actually living out what you tell people you believe.
Fantastic. I love that. This is Dave Garrison. We're here today with Congressman Trey Gowdy, and we'll return after a few messages from our sponsors.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
This is Dave Garrison, and return now to our discussion with Congressman Trey Gowdy of South Carolina. I've often told the listeners a story. When I was running for Congress in Texas, I mentioned at a big event, a great big debate, that abortion was America's Holocaust. And it got in the Fort Worth paper and some others. And my political consultant, who had been Marco Rubio's campaign manager, called me right away and he said, Dave, you need to quit saying stuff like that. And I said, here's the deal. When I hired you, I told you, you can suggest ways for me to say things, but you will never tell me what to say and what not to say. And, for people like yourself and others, when we stand out there and speak publicly on those things, we're going to take some shots. And I think God expects that of us. Well, let's jump into...
You know what?
Go ahead.
It was what, almost exactly at this point in the week, in Holy Week, when Jesus lost a voice vote to a guy named Barabbas. So if Jesus can lose a voice vote, then you and I can lose elections.
Yeah,
and we're not called to be victorious, we're called to be obedient. Yeah. So if that's what you think you should have said, then you should have said it.
And I did.
The results take care of themselves.
And I keep saying it. With over 55 million children killed in this country, there's something really wrong with a nation that allows that. And speaking of that, in your oversight committee, you're able to take some whacks at Eric Holder, Attorney General, and get to talk a lot about Lois Lerner and the IRS. Is that a frustrating assignment when you're sitting there with those people and knowing they're going to kind of thumb their nose at Congress and the Constitution?
Well, Lois Lerner is much more frustrating than Eric Holder. Whatever differences I have with the Attorney General, and there are many, he at least answers the question. Mm-hmm. And he sits there, and I'm sure it is not a comfortable couple of hours. I have a very, very different view of what the Attorney General should be than what I have seen since he's been the Attorney General. But at least he answers the question. Lois Lerner, to target people because they wanted to educate folks about the Constitution, to then give a self-serving, exculpatory opening statement and then hide behind the Fifth Amendment, even though you just testified, is much more frustrating to me than Eric Holder. Kathleen Sebelius was much more frustrating to me than Eric Holder.
Yeah, I've watched your frustration.
Well, there was an old video. Kathleen Sebelius famously announced that she had weighed and balanced our right with religious liberty with the right to free contraception. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, one of those is in the Constitution and the other is not. So how did you weigh and balance those? And it was one of the worst 5-minute performances I have ever seen a cabinet-level person have. Mm-hmm. She has no interest in the law, a very little interest in the Constitution. It was all about politics, at least with Holder, to me, and I don't know him well, but to me, he really, really believes it. Now, that does not keep him from being wrong.
Right.
But he really believes it. And with Lerner and Sebelius, I just kind of view them as just sheer raw gutter politics.
I have a lot of people that come up to me because of my experiences in life, I guess we'll call it, and they'll say, do we have an administration who, and I'll put it in this way, that truth is elusive to them? Do they lie just only for political expediency? The lawyer in me always wants to perform more Socratic method on them, trying to get them there. And I've seen you try to do that to a very frustrating end. But do you feel like truth is different for them?
Well, no, I think there's a lot of relativism. I think there's a lot of, so long as our motives are good, whatever means we employ to reach our goal should be understood. So they judge everything
from a Saul Alinsky point of view, yeah.
Well, I mean, going all the way back to a guy named Niccolo Machiavelli. But I thought that we as a culture had kind of rejected this notion that the end justifies the means. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're an attorney, I'm an attorney. If the end justified the means, then we wouldn't throw out convictions of people that we know committed the crime. But it happens every day. Yeah. Because the police failed to put one part of the Miranda warnings in their interaction with defendants. So you can't value process here, but totally throw it to the wind there. I think we had to go to the floor of the House to try to pass a bill to get the executive to enforce the law. There are 3 groups that provide oversight. You mentioned the Oversight Committee. We are the least powerful of the 3. The media, in theory, is supposed to provide oversight, and the voters, in reality, are supposed to provide oversight. And I get that the voters are frustrated, and I get that they're tuning out politics, especially our kids' generation, but that ultimately is the group that is supposed to provide the correction and the oversight in our system, is the voters.
I heard from David Kenneman. He acquired the George Barna Research Group, and one of the things that he was saying, and then I was talking also to Lee Strobel, who's a famous apologist, and Josh McDowell, and all of them repeated this thing to me, that a lot of the young people believe that if it works, it must be true, rather than if it's true, it must work. And that's the way I kind of see the administration. It's frustrating to all of us, and for somebody like you are having to question those people like that, I can't imagine how much frustration you go through. So, we always thank the military for their service, and as many congressmen and women that I've known, the service that you guys have to do on our behalf. I know the opinion polls are so low, but I don't think people understand what you're having to face every day. And I don't know if you need or want to comment to that, but I just want to say thank you for your service.
Well, you were kind to say it. I tell my colleagues in Congress, unlike the military and unlike other groups, we have a say-so over whether we serve or not. And if it gets to be too frustrating...
But they're volunteer, too.
You can always go do something else. Mm-hmm. I'm asked a lot when I get home, how can you put up with it?
Sure.
The reality is there are some good people in Congress. We just don't hear their names because
Right.
they don't drive drunk and they don't cheat on their
Right.
wives and they don't get arrested. So we have a tendency not to hear the Jim Jordans of the world and the Jason Chavitzes of the world. And those are just quality people that I
Sure.
would want to be my next door neighbor. But because they live virtuous lives, we don't, my kids know who they are because they hear me mention their name. But most people are much more familiar with Anthony Weiner than they are a guy named Phil Rowe from Tennessee.
Right. Yeah.
Phil Rowe saved a man's life at the Charlotte airport.
Right.
And
he's a doctor.
And it, maybe gets a blur, but Anthony Weiner is this, cultural icon. And I don't get it.
I don't either. This is Dave Garrison. We're here today with Congressman Trey Gowdy, and we'll return after a few messages from our sponsors.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
This is Dave Garrison, and return now to our discussion with Congressman Trey Gowdy of South Carolina. Maybe a question to ask in this way is, why are Americans putting up with these violations of the rule of law and U.S. Constitution? When I interviewed Rick Santorum, who's going to be here next week, he's going to sit with a group of folks that I put together. We also have Ben Carson and John Maxwell. But when I interviewed him, he said that the problem is liberals want it more than we do. Do you concur with him?
I would probably phrase it a little bit differently. I would say that liberals are more united in their goal. There is less fracturing within that movement than there is within the conservative movement. We are, you mentioned Marco Rubio's name.
Right.
Marco, whom I very much like personally, went from a front runner in 2016 to almost an afterthought, essentially because of one issue. And I'm not trying to change anybody's mind about that one issue. But,
immigration, yeah.
But Nancy Pelosi presided over the loss of the House, and they kept her as their leader. And there's very little fracturing. There's very little infighting on that side. And on our side, we're debating whether being right 90% of the time is enough. Does it need to be 92? Does it need to be 95? And so, I remember my parents telling me, you can fight with your sisters if you want to inside the house, but when you go in public, I don't ever want to hear it.
Right.
And I do wish sometimes that we had robust debates and discussions within the family, but publicly, if we would just maybe spend just as much time highlighting the things we have in common as the things that we don't. You have, I've got friends that are libertarians. I serve with a couple in Congress, but invariably you'll see a libertarian like Cuccinelli was running in Virginia, but there was a libertarian running. The guy in Florida who just won, there was a libertarian running. You don't see anyone to the left drawing off votes. And so I wasn't good at math, hence my history degree. But at some point in politics, if the goal is to win, you do have to factor in how much fracturing you're doing.
Cal Thomas and Bob Beckel wrote a book, and I can't remember the title of it. I'll put a link to it for the listeners, as well as some links to some of your materials, Congressman. But one of the things that I think there are about 5 or 6 principles that I think all that call themselves conservatives agree to. Limited government, adherence to the founding principles in the U.S. Constitution, personal responsibility, rule of law, fiscal responsibility, and national sovereignty. If we could just get all the people that agree with those principles, and frankly, those are the Tea Party principles, we should be unified. And it's too bad we're not. But I heard the other day.
I call them non-negotiables from a theological standpoint. I mean, if you question the deity of Christ, that's a really serious point of departure. It's probably not if you, even after having read Paul's letters, if you, as a Christian woman, decide that you're going to wear makeup and jewelry, that to me is not a non-negotiable.
Yeah.
So we got to figure out within the conservative movement. And the other thing we have to figure out is who gets to define it, who gets to decide, because we don't really have a leader per se. There's no one that we look to and say, well, what do you think? And I'm all for the debate. Heavens knows I like to debate. I just wish sometimes we could have that conversation within the family and then maybe present a little more of a unified front to the undecided, and especially to the younger generation.
Well, you've sponsored a couple of bills recently that really fascinate me, and one of them's, I think the number is H.R. 4138, Enforce the Law Act. What prompted you to sponsor that bill, and what's the purpose of the bill that made you even want to do it in the first place?
Well, when you are tired of seeing the executive branch not enforce the law,
there you go.
Then you start looking for your remedies on how to get that enforcement, whether it's immigration law, whether it's the Affordable Care Act and the missed deadlines and exemptions, or the case I like to cite the most, mandatory minimums in drug cases. When you see the executive branch just summarily ignoring the law, then you look for a remedy to get them to enforce it. And the Enforce Act allowed us to have, you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
For your listeners, you have to have standing to go to court.
Right.
It afforded us legal standing to challenge the executive branch to get an order requiring them to enforce the law.
I thought that was the First Amendment, the right to petition the government for grievance. Well, I guess I'm trying to...
And I also am almost positive that the main obligation of the executive branch is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. I mean, that's in the Constitution. That's your job.
But didn't Eric Holder say undocumented immigrants have a civil right to violate the law?
Yes, he did, which is, it is a dumbfounding thing to say, and it is oxymoronic that you would have a civil right to not follow the law.
Well, I especially agree with the last part of oxymoronic.
Yeah, it's impossible to reconcile, which is if you have more than, well, he was just before judiciary, and I spent my time, there's a statute that says X. He issues a memo directing all of his assistant United States attorneys to do Y.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there trying to have a conversation with him on whether his memo, if he really believes it trumps a statute. It's just a different worldview. They have a different definition of prosecutorial discretion that frankly swallows the rule of law. But at a certain point, it can't just be members of Congress that are saying, what would be great would be if someone said, Mr. Holder, we actually agree with you on policy. We think where you're trying to go is the right policy, but the way you're doing it is totally wrong. That would be nice. And instead of Democrats standing and cheering when the president says, I'll do it with or without you, it'd be nice if some Democrats stood up and said, no, sir, Mr. President, I like you, I voted for you, but you will not do it with or without Congress.
Is this because the president has a much different worldview than you and I might have? And it's just really an opposing worldviews?
Well, initially he did not. If you go back and read the quotes from Senator Obama, he was very concerned about what he considered to be lawless activity during the Bush administration. I think it is about winning elections, and I think it is taking advantage of an electorate that for the most part has checked out when it comes to politics because of distrust. Government is so big, they view it as being so powerful. What's the use in standing and fighting? And so you're left with people who pay attention to politics a lot, and you're left with a media that is largely sycophantish. I mean, what's the last tough question he got? Super Bowl Sunday with Bill O'Reilly, and he flubbed that. Well, I mean, he flubbed that. He said there was not a smidgen of corruption in the IRS scandal. Well, how do you know that, Mr. President? The investigation's still ongoing. I mean, the follow-up questions are, I mean, I was being flip when I said that I get tougher questions in the Bojangles drive-through, but I do. I mean, when I'm asked, do you want a Bo-Berry biscuit, I have to think about that much longer than he has to think about answering most of the questions he gets.
This is Dave Garrison. We're here today with Congressman Trey Gowdy, and we'll return after a few messages from our sponsors.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
This is Dave Garrison, and return now to our discussion with Congressman Trey Gowdy of South Carolina. Well, the other day I asked for a BLT sandwich, and the gal asked me what meat I wanted on it. So I think maybe we're running into the same kind of worldview or something. But something that happened in a conference that I went to a while back, and I heard Christians get into quite an argument because one real influential conservative in America jumped on someone because he was trying to say, Christians, there are so many of you that just left the presidential, they went in and voted, but when it came to the president, they left it blank because they felt like they couldn't vote for a Mormon and they couldn't vote for President Obama. And if you go back and look at some of those numbers that I've seen, had Christians voted in the percentages that they have at sometimes in the past, and had they actually filled out the presidential vote, we would have a different president. What do you advise to the believers that are listening today, voting philosophy when it comes to things like that?
Well, I would say two things. Number one, I would quote or paraphrase Martin Luther. I would rather be ruled by a smart Turk than a dumb Christian. So if Martin Luther said that, who's the father of Protestantism, that's probably okay for us. The second point that I would make is I do not know Governor Romney personally at all. I do eat dinner a lot in Washington with members of the Mormon faith, and they are among the most moral, conscientious,
family-oriented,
live what they profess to believe groups. Jason Chaffetz is a different religion than me. Mm-hmm. I would vote for him for anything because I know his character. So, you know, this notion that because they perceive Romney to be not correct on one issue, that they're going to allow someone who is incorrect on 100 issues to become president, I do not understand that.
The person who said this in front of this big group got really hammered by someone else, is saying by voting that way, like you and I both agree to, you're not voting your biblical convictions, because you shouldn't cast a vote for someone that is against the biblical principles that we hold.
And that assumes that we know what is in other people's hearts. We have seen multiple examples of people who profess to be X, but in reality their actions indicate Y. Jimmy Carter was a professing born again. He used the phrase born again because he was ridiculed for it, Christian. That was no guarantee of good government. So I don't know who it was. It certainly wasn't me. Somebody a lot smarter than me said, I am not electing a pastor-in-chief. I am electing a commander-in-chief. I would love to have somebody who matched up with me from a theological standpoint. But as I laid out for you early on in our conversation, I'm responsible for my own faith. I'm not looking to the president for that. I'm looking for somebody who's going to carry out constitutional responsibilities. And anyone who thinks that Mitt Romney would not have this country in a better position, foreign policy and domestic policy-wise, than where we are now, I would just respectfully beg to differ.
Well, now some people, and you probably won't agree with this, but when they look at you, they look at a Ted Cruz, a Rand Paul, and maybe there's a couple others, they call you polarizing figures. What do you think of that when you hear me say that?
I think the media likes stories like that. I think the media would rather say that than to come back and look at the number of folks I hired when I was a district attorney who don't vote in the Republican primary. I think if the media were to go interview a Tulsi Gabbard, who's a Democrat congresswoman from Hawaii, or Joey Kennedy from Massachusetts, or Peter Welch, or frankly any of the Democrats that I work with, I think they would tell you he's among the least polarizing people that we work with. I think they confuse polarizing with strong convictions. If you have strong convictions on the other side, they like you. If you have strong convictions on the conservative side, then you're polarizing. That's like the word ultra. Have you ever seen a Supreme Court justice described as ultra-liberal? No, it's only ultra-conservative.
Right.
You're only a polarizing conservative. I mean, Al Franken is not a polarizing liberal in their mind. So, I mean, the media has been sycophantish towards progressive causes since I was a kid, and I've just lost all hope that that's going to change.
Well, I know you're short on time, but I did want to get to another bill that you've introduced, what I heard it called as a bipartisan college affordability legislation. What's that about? Well,
speaking of Peter Welch, Peter is a progressive from Vermont that I have a really, really good relationship with. Well, you know, Peter and I agree that education and hard work is the pathway to prosperity. But Absolutely. We also realize the college tuition is tough. My son got into and was going to go to a school that was $50,000 a year. That is a lot of money for everybody, but it's especially a lot of money for folks who are in the middle class. So Peter and I said, you know what? We don't want to tell schools what to do, but it'd be good if we could look at federal regulations that, however well-intended, may be driving up the cost of tuition. Now, it may be that you say this regulation is impacting tuition, but it's still worth keeping. Or it may be that you conclude we didn't think this was going to happen. This was an unintended consequence. So this is simply a study. We just want to look at the regulatory apparatus and see whether or not it is impacting tuition. And then the next conversation is obviously whether or not you do anything about it. But it's a pretty benign thing to me to want to see whether our regulatory apparatus is having unintended consequences.
Well, I can tell you, since I'm the dean of the School of Business and Government here at Ohio Christian University, we had to hire 3 times as many federal, or the financial aid, that's the term I was looking for, personnel because of the federalization of school loans. And I wrote a column for the Washington Examiner called The Camel's Nose Under the Tent about what's really going on with the federal school loans. That is one major piece that has dramatically increased the cost. But school loans, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, every time the students can get more money for school loans, next thing you know, universities drive up the cost of tuition because they can. And
yes,
that's kind of a real tragedy.
Well, that's a perfect example. I'm going Monday to speak on a college campus, and I wish more of my Republican colleagues would do it. You get a lot of tough questions. But what I always ask those kids is, why are you not more interested in the principle? Well, why is every question you ask me about taking the interest rate from 3.4 to 6.8?
Yeah.
Are you not interested in the principle? Is it just the interest rate? Because if you watch the news at night, all you hear are those crazy, heartless House Republicans are going to no longer subsidize student loans at the same rate that they are. But there's no conversation about tuition.
Well, something that you might want to look at, and it's something we see to a minor extent here at our university, But I know of absolutely perfect examples where the students will borrow as much as they can. They borrow more because our school, for instance, is fairly inexpensive. We've been keeping the rates down. We're one of the least expensive in Ohio. They'll take that money, they go buy cars and do all sorts of stuff with the money because they can get refunds for what they don't use. And so a lot of that school loan money is actually refunded to some of these students and building up the debt.
Absolutely. I have seen it. I miscalculated. My son came up with the cost of tuition, and then he was, because he got his mom's genes, he was eligible for a state scholarship. Well, that the money still came to us. It was still loaned, even though it was not to the dime what you needed for tuition or books or living expenses. So indebtedness is at an all-time high. The default rate's at an all-time high. And some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, their answer for that is to continue to make money incredibly easy to borrow. Logically, it doesn't make sense.
And that does drive up tuition, and I think we should look a lot more into that. Now, Congressman J.C. Watts, former congressman, I don't know if you've heard of him or not.
Oh, sure.
Sure. He made a comment on our show that when a congressman gets to Washington, he first thinks it's a cesspool, but 6 months later, he thinks it's a sauna. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it kind of depends on how you spend your time. I am a creature of routine. I do the same thing every day. There's a popular show on Netflix now called House of Cards.
Right.
You'd be stunned at how many people ask my wife, "Is it really like that?" And I'm sitting there thinking, well, no members of Congress kill each other. No, I mean, not since I've been there. It is. It depends on who you hang out with.
Yeah.
The group that I hang out with, we take our committee work seriously. We eat dinner together, and then we go to the gym and embarrass ourselves as 50-year-old guys who are trying to play sports do. And then
I've been to your gym. I've been to your gym. I've seen it.
Well, I mean, for me, I get to D.C. right before votes on the first day, and I come home right after last votes on the last day. So, I'm in South Carolina as much as you can possibly be without missing votes or committee hearings. I don't know what it was like when Congressman Watts was there. The group that I hang out with, your listeners would say, that's the kind of person that I want teaching my kid in Sunday school or being a Boy Scout or Girl Scout leader. They're good people, but I don't go to the drop-ins and the cocktail parties afterwards. So maybe it's different for other members, but for me,
they're also getting at, Congressman, is that people do want you. They want to influence you. They want to, which you say you don't do much of, which I appreciate, is being wined and dined and all that sort of stuff. And then you have Democrat Congressman Jim Moran, who wants a raise for you all because he claims, and I know that for a fact, there are congressmen that sleep in their offices because they say it's too expensive in D.C.
But that's more of a function of the cost of living in D.C. There are also firefighters and teachers and nurses who are trying to live in Washington, D.C. on a whole lot less than $174,000. So I will say this, and I probably missed a chance to demagogue my Democrat colleagues, but it's the truth. I've not heard a single member of Congress other than Representative Moran say that, not Republican or Democrat. We are incredibly lucky and blessed to have the jobs that we do. We make more than 99.9% of the people that we work for, and nobody makes you run. If you can't live on that salary and you think you can make more doing something else, then when your 2-year gig is up, then go do something else.
Yeah, and not a whole lot of them try and do that unless they're not elected.
Usually you're pushed out the window. You don't jump.
Right. Or they get redistricted out for one reason or the other. Maybe
and then many of them will do everything in the world to come back, which I also don't get. Yeah, I'm sure that if Mr. Moran were running for re-election, he would not have said what he said. Maybe he felt, liberated because he's not running again. But I haven't met a Republican or Democrat that thinks that we are incredibly fortunate to have. And this is just the group I hang around with, but they think it's an honor. And first of all, public service suggests that you are giving something up.
And it's a little bit of a sidebar, but it just sprung out to me. Something I don't agree with Megyn Kelly on, Greta Van Susteren, and several of the others. They will talk about how little you guys are in session. And I know that when you guys are in session, you're not at your house on a lounge, just sitting in the back, drinking a Mai Tai. You're out there in meetings and getting out there with the voters and trying to find out what they think, and you're having town halls. You're doing all sorts of stuff. When you're not in session, you're still at work. Am I wrong about this?
No. God bless you for saying that. I think anyone who has watched me on Greta's show knows that I am crazy about her. She is smart.
Oh, yeah. Well, another
she
prosecutor.
Great questions. But I wish that she would come home to South Carolina with me, because it is actually tougher when you're in district than when you're in D.C., because you can't say no when you're in your district. You can't, or there's a reluctance to say no to anything. If I'm asked to go somewhere in South Carolina, particularly in my district, the overwhelming likelihood is that I'm going to accept it. In D.C., because there's no one up there who can vote for you, I'm much more likely to say no.
Yes.
No, I've got, if you were to look at Mick Mulvaney's schedule or any of the guys, Tim Scott, if you look at Tim Scott's schedule when he is in South Carolina, it is much, much busier than when he's in D.C. So I thank you for pointing that out, but we're probably fighting an uphill losing battle on convincing people of that. But you're exactly right. When you're in district, if you take the job seriously, you're actually working harder than you are when you're in D.C.
Well, as much as I like Fox News, this is an area where I think they need to really be fair and balanced. And if they asked me on the show, I would tell them exactly, because I've spent a lot of time with congressmen and various other government people, senators and whatever, and I see how hard they work. It is not a cushy job like a lot of people think it is. Well, I know we're really short of time, and Congressman, you are so articulate. You're one of my favorite people when it comes to hearings, so I know when Holder or any of those other people are there. The other day, I just watched with rapt attention when you had the law professor, and I don't know who the other person was, and you were trying to pin him down as to what degree the Attorney General or the administration had the right to not prosecute, to not uphold the law. And it was fascinating conversation, and you did a fantastic job. So,
thank you for saying that.
Well, we thank you so much for being on the show. And listeners, you pay attention to who Congressman Trey Gowdy is, because we have an articulate spokesman. I know a lot of times we go, oh, those lawyers up in Congress. But with what they're dealing, and I'm not just saying this because I have a law degree and I'm licensed in Texas, but I have what I often say is real jobs all the time. It takes that kind of mentality to deal with some of those bureaucrats and the people that and the bills and all this sort of stuff. Whether we like it or not, that's the hand we've been dealt. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you for your stand for Christ.
It was a real treat and a real honor, and thank you, and God bless you and your listeners.
On behalf of our host, Dave Garrison, I'd like to thank you for listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show today. For additional information about the show, please go to faithandliberty.org, where you can access previous shows, like us on our Faith and Liberty Facebook page, and access other resources. Please keep in mind that the Faith and Liberty Talk Show exists only with the generosity and support of our listeners. If the show is of value to you, we would appreciate you visiting our website, faithandliberty.org, and donating to the show. The opinions and comments represent the views of our speakers and may or may not represent the views of Ohio Christian University. May God bless you, and thank you for listening to our show.